Good evening to everyone, and welcome to the shiur to everybody who's online, as well as to those who are here. And we're going to look at the month of Tamuz, which started today, and try and get some deeper understanding into it, as we have done with the previous months that we've learned together. We start off with a posuk from Devarim, and the essence of what we're going to start looking at is the difference between our capacity to experience the world by what we see and to experience the world by what we hear. We are like a utensil. We are a kli. We are a vessel. And we are filled with the total of all our life experiences. And they're always with us. You can't get rid of them. They're there. And our experiences of existence we have through our senses, and primarily through the sense of sight and the sense of hearing. Understanding the difference between these two, and even more so in the current environment in which we're operating, in which we're living, where we feel such a disconnect between what we see and what we hear. So if you look at the example that I give is, we were just overseas in the United States, and I described to people there what life was like in Eretz Israel at the moment, and they were amazed. And thanks so much for sharing, because that's not the impression we have. That's not what we read. That's not what we think. They imagine life as very different from what it is over here, those who haven't actually visited in recent times. And in the same way, when we think of life in America or in the UK, we think of an enormous amount of anti-Semitism, which there is, but we think of it, what we hear is different to what you experience when you actually are on the ground. So we've got to understand, how do you live in an environment? We hear so much. We're bombarded with so much information. We're bombarded with so much news. But the news that we hear is not always an accurate manifestation of what's really happening. And we know that here in Israel so clearly, because we see the international news. We see what is said about Israel. And we know it's not accurate. We know that's not what's happening at all. And those of us who are in the know that even more so. Those of us who've actually been in Gaza and are in Gaza know that what's being reported has no bearing on what's actually happening on the ground. So in every aspect of life, there is this disconnect. What we're hearing, what we're reading, what we're being informed about, and what is actually happening is different. So what we're hearing, what the news we get, the information we get, that's all shmiya. We're hearing that. What we see, this doesn't match up. So how do you live in an existence where what you're seeing and what you're hearing is not matching up? Where we start is this posuk in Dvarim, V'yatei tiyeh lecha al azanecha, where the Torah gives us a strange halacha in a way, and that is when you go to war, in addition to taking all your other equipment and your ammunition, make sure to take a spade, a shovel, so that v'haya b'shivtecha chutz, so that if you go to relieve yourself out in the fields, v'chafarta v'shavta v'chisita tseatecha, so that if you have to relieve yourself out in the field, you'll cover it up afterwards. Make sure that you have a shovel ready for that purpose. And the Ibn Ezra says just a few words which are so telling. Kol davar nir'eh la'ayin. The reason you've got to cover it up, because anything the eye sees, your lid demut genai benefesh, embeds itself in a negative way in the soul. You can't see something and avoid the soul being impacted by it, the soul being affected by it. We think you see something, you turn away, you forget about it, it's gone. Nothing that we see is gone. Nothing that we see is forgotten. Everything that we see is an impression that is made upon us, and it's made, as the Ibn Ezra says, even benefesh. And if you see something ugly, there's an impression of ugliness left in the nefesh. And therefore, where there's anything that has the capacity to create an ugly impression, we cover it up. That's what that posuk comes to teach us. It comes to teach us much more than the practicality of hygiene, the practicality of how to manage the toilet when one's out in the field. It's much more than that. It's to teach us this idea that we need to protect our souls from seeing things that are potentially ugly. Now the Gemara in Ketuvot learns a whole important piece from this. Mai dichtiv v'yatei tiyeh lecha al azanecha. Why does the Torah tell us that we need to have this shovel there in addition to our other weaponry and ammunition, whatever it is that we have? Why doesn't it say, just take a shovel? Al tikre azanecha el al oznecha. Says the Gemara, there's a second layer of meaning to this, which has nothing to do with the battlefield. It does have what to do with what the Ibn Ezra said. And that is, azanecha doesn't just mean your equipment, your weapons. It also means oznecha, your ears. Which means a yated, you need a wedge. A yated also means a wedge. You need a wedge for your ears. She'im yishma adam davar she'eino hagun. Just as you don't want to see something which isn't attractive, you don't want to see something which is ugly because of the impression it makes, so you don't want to hear something which isn't pleasant, something which is ugly. And if you're in a situation where something is being said that is potentially ugly and that could be bothering, that could be creating a negative impression on your soul, yaniach etzba'o ba'oznav. You put your ear into your finger into your ear, you block your ears. And your fingers are specifically designed so as to go into your ears and to be able to block your ears. That's what Rabbi Lazar meant when he said, why are our fingers designed like wedges? Why are they wedge-shaped? If you want to say it's because each of our fingers has a different purpose. Even in the Torah, we use all fingers for different reasons. We use the little finger for certain things in the Beis Hamikdash. Zu Kemitza, we use the fourth finger. Zu Amah, the third finger. Zu Etzba, the pointed finger. Zu Godel, we use it. All sorts of different avodot in the Beis Hamikdash. We use our fingers, and each finger has a particular purpose. And Amata Meshupot Ki Yetedot, but they could be oblong. They don't have to be wedge-shaped. They fit so perfectly into the ear. Shim yishma adam davar she'eino hagun, yaneach etzba'otav ba'oznav. So that if you hear something which you shouldn't hear, you put your finger into your ear. Tana deber Rabbi Yishmael, mipnei ma ozen kula kasher v'ha'alya raka. Says in the Tana deber Rabbi Yishmael, why is the ear all made of hard cartilage, but the lobe of the ear is soft? Shim yishma adam davar she'eino hagun, yachuf eleha l'tocha. That's an additional sealing. You can put your finger and the lobe into your ear and really seal it well so that you don't hear any, you insulate your ear. Tanu Rabbanan, al yashmi adam loznav dvarim betelim. Don't even let your ear hear dvarim betelim. We're not even talking about things that are ugly, or even things she'eno hagun, things which are not proper. Even dvarim betelim, just nonsense. You don't have to hear nonsense. If you do, the ear suffers first. The ear takes in the nonsense, and it just doesn't do the ear any good. What does all that mean? That our body is designed in such a way, and we have to block the ear. What does it really mean? So let's learn a piece of Maharal together. The Maharal says, Harei ozno shel adam petucha nivret. The ear of a person is created open. Such that if somebody in your environment is saying something ugly or unpleasant, you can't help but hear it. It's not something that you can protect yourself against. The ear's open. Whatever is being said, all the sound in the area is penetrating your ear. Which means you are taking something negative into you. That's what's important about the ear. It's the only sense that really takes what's happening outside and takes it into your brain, into your mind. It absorbs it, and it penetrates right into your very being, the ear. And says the Maharal, anything which you mekabel, anything which you receive, anything that you take in, stays with you. So the Ibn Ezra talked about the fact that anything you see makes an impression on you, and the Maharal here is talking about, but if you hear something, it penetrates deep into you and it stays there. It's not as bad as seeing. When you see something, you haven't taken it in. When you see something, it's still outside of you. It's true, as the Ibn Ezra said, it makes an impression on you, but you aren't actually taking it you're not taking the substance of it in. Aval hashmiyah hi Kabbalah, but when you listen to something, when you hear something, you mekabel, you're actually taking it in. Uchamosh tigem unkelus al kol shmiyah Kabbalah. As you'll see, unkelus in the Torah, whenever the word shmiyah, Shema Yisrael, any time that the word Shema is used in the Chumash, Onkelos translates that as mekabel, accepting it, taking it in. Because that's what Shmi'ah is. When you're hearing something, you're taking it in, you're integrating it, you're understanding it, you're absorbing it, you're thinking about it. Your mind is much more active when you're listening than it is when you're just seeing something. And the Maharal goes on to say, V'al yaksheh lama ha'ozen nivra yoter patuach mishar kol ha'evarim, v'lama lo nivra kamo ha'ayin sheyesh lo kisui. If that's the case, ask the Maharal, why don't we have earlets? The same as we've got eyelids. You can close your eye. Why should we have to put our fingers in our ears? If receiving things through our ears is so harmful, why isn't the ear, doesn't it have the capacity to close itself? Hein be'emet davar zeh davar amok u'muflag b'yitzira. This is something deep and needs to be and wondrous in the creation. V'zeh ki adam asher hu cherish eino adam. A deaf person is not classified as a real living full human being. And we know in halakha, cherish, a deaf person, like a shoteh and a katan, shara cherish, shoteh ve'katan, einan nechshavim adam. They're not considered as human beings in relation to a number of different halachot that don't apply to a person if he's deaf, just as if he's under bar mitzvah age, or doesn't have his mental faculties. V'davar zeh bi'anu l'mala ki ha'adam nechshav kamo kli, because a human being is a vessel. A vessel that hasn't the capacity to receive into it. Is not a kli at all. So by definition, a human being has to be open. That's what a human being is. A human being takes in. So our capacity to take in, to understand, to absorb, to integrate ideas, that requires open ears. And you've got to be open to everything. You've got to hear things even that you don't want to hear, things that you don't agree with hearing. If we had the capacity just to turn our ears on and off, you can imagine we wouldn't listen to anything that we find a little bit uncomfortable. But sometimes what we find uncomfortable is the most important thing to be hearing. So our ears are designed to be open all the time. Everything we hear comes in. ולפיכך החירש שאינו שומע ומקבל הדברים אין לו בית קיבול והוא נחשב כמו גולם כלי עץ ולפיכך בריאת האדם פתוחה כמו כלי שיש לו בית קיבול פתוח. And so we are created like an open vessel that is open on the top, like a pot that can take things into it. We can collect experiences, and we have to collect experiences. That's what makes us human. Each of our collection of experiences is what makes us who we are. והסתימה מצד אחר. And the blockage to the ear is outside. It's the finger. Lo mitzad ha'ever hazeh, not the ear itself. Because if it was be'ever atzmo stima, lo haya nechshav adam hazeh patuach, kmo ha'kli sheyesh alav kistui she'ena nechshav patuach. Imagine a pot that is sealed. That's not a pot. A pot is a pot. If you can open it and put things in it. Yes, you've got a lid you can put over it. We've got fingers we can put into our ears. But the default of the ear is open. There are times when you've got to shut your ear, and that takes a bit of effort. You've actually got to put your fingers into your ear to shut your ear. If you don't do that, your ear is open. And if your ear is open, it's taking in from everything that's happening around it. That's the power of Shmiyah. So we need to be able to hear, to be able to take in that which we hear. We need to be able to see, to be impressed by what we see, as the Ibn Ezra says. So we see from the eye, that everything we see, even something ugly, your lid dmut ganai benefesh. If we see something ugly, it creates an impression of negativity in the soul. But the ear is even more so. The ear, what we absorb, we take in, becomes part of us. We integrate it, it's taken into ourselves. And the gift of being open, because being open is a gift, and that's part of what the ear is, open to ideas, open to thoughts, open to experiences. But if we allow ourselves to be so open that negative thoughts and ideas also penetrate, that has a negative effect on us. Now, why that's important for us at the moment is because the month of Tammuz, the Sefer Yetzirah says, Himlich ot chet biriyah, Hashem used the letter chet in the creation of the month of Tammuz, and we'll see why that's relevant in a moment, and the power of vision. You remember in the Sefer Yetzirah, we've always got a letter of the alphabet, we've got one of the capacities of a human being, one of the living capacities of the human being, in this case it's vision, and one of the limbs of the human being, in this case it's the right hand. And Hashem associated this with cancer, the constellation in the universe, the Tammuz b'shana, and the month of Tammuz in the year. What we're going to be interested in is the letter Chet. Tammuz is the month not of Shmiyah, not the month of hearing. Tammuz is the month of vision, the month of being able to see. And the letter is Chet, and we're going to see why that's important. Now, this idea of seeing goes beyond being able to see a physical thing. So yes, I can hold this glass in front of me and I can see a glass of water. I know that's what it is. I'm using my power of vision to see it. But the power of vision goes far beyond that. One of the things that we use, one of the words where we use vision in the Tanakh is the idea of a ro'eh. And we told in Shmuel, Lefanim b'Yisrael ko amar ha'ish belechto lidrosh Elohim lechu v'nelcha ad haro'eh. When Shaul was going looking for his father's donkeys, and they told him that there was a ro'eh in the town. A ro'eh is a visionary, somebody you can see. And they used to call this person a ro'eh when somebody wanted to get a message from God. You wanted to know what Hashem was saying to you. You went to the ro'eh. Ki lenavi hayom yikareh lefanim haro'eh. Because that which we now call a navi, we used to call a ro'eh. And the difference between the word navi and the word ro'eh is explained in the Malbim, where the Malbim says, Yesh evdel bein hanavi b'dor acharon uvein haro'eh lifnim. There's a difference between the idea of a navi, which is the word that used to be used, and the idea of a ro'eh. She'hanavi nikra shmo al shem dibrotav v'tochachatav melashon niv sfatayim. What is a navi? The word navi comes from niv, which is expression. Oral expression, to be able to communicate verbally. That's what a Navi does. And he says because Hashem would send a Navi to tell the Jewish people where they're going wrong, what they're doing wrong, to give musar to them. But he wouldn't send them, says the Malbim, to give personal guidance to an individual. That wasn't the role of a Navi. A Navi was sent for the klal, to give the nation a message from Hashem, and to give the nation direction as to where they were going. Aval haro'eh nikra bishmo al shem shayat sofeh b'ruach HaKodesh hashoreh alav. But the ro'eh was different. The ro'eh was able to see, sofeh, he had a vision. He could see using ruach HaKodesh. Kol advarim ha'ovim va'atidim. He could see what was happening in the present, so he was able to tell Shaul, your donkeys have been found. V'ha'atidim, and they could see into the future. V'gam inyanei ha'yichidim ufratehem, and they could also see matters that were associated to an individual's needs, not only to the needs of the community. V'aken borchim min ha'navi asher haya tamid magid pesho mochiach alei aven, and therefore you'll find, says the Malbim, that people would run away from the prophets, from the Nevi'im, because they would always have bad news. They would always be telling people what's wrong with them, and nobody wants to hear that. People want to be entertained. People want to be uplifted. People want to be inspired. And when the Navi used to get up to speak, there was nobody in the room. People used to run a mile. But a ro'eh, if there was a ro'eh, people would line up outside. So it's a little bit like that now. If you get one of these Kabbalists come to town, and he can tell you what's going to happen in your life, and when you're going to get married, and whether you're going to have a child, there's a long line of people waiting to see the Kabbalists, because people want ro'im, they want people who can see. But if a Baal Musar comes to give a drosha, if somebody comes to give a talk, not quite the same, because people don't want to hear that. Although it's more important for them to hear where they're going wrong than what's going to happen in the future, but people like the ro'eh, and the Malbim points that out, and therefore the ro'eh is somebody's people used to pursue. And the Navi is somebody that people used to avoid, because the Navi would communicate what Hashem told him about the state of the Jewish people, and the Ro'eh would communicate a vision, what he was able to see. And people like vision. They like to see the vision. So that's the idea of the Ro'eh and the power of Re'iyah. So Re'iyah doesn't only mean seeing a physical object. It doesn't just mean us looking at each other as we are at the moment. It doesn't just mean being able to see a physical object in front of me. That's part of what Re'iyah is. That's Re'iyah with the eye. But one can see without the eye, and we're going to be looking at that as well. You don't need the eye to see. The eye is the vehicle with which we see physical things. But the Ro'eh, when we're talking about this Ro'eh, which Shmuel HaNavi was called the Ro'eh, their capacity to see the future, their capacity to vision, their capacity to see what was going on in a person's life, They weren't using their physical eye for that. They were using an inner eye. They were using a much more spiritual form of vision to be able to see that. And that vision, that ability to have intuition, to be able to sense, to be able to see something other people can't see. That's what a visionary really is, isn't that so? Even in the business world, you get a visionary who sees an opportunity that others can't see. If everybody could see the opportunity, it wouldn't be an opportunity. The reason it's an opportunity is only because some people can see it and most people can't. The people who can see it aren't seeing it with their physical eyes, but that's still called a vision. They're able to visualize something that other people don't see. And that power of vision is something which can also lead people astray. So it's a very powerful gift to be able to visualize and to be able to see into the future and to be able to understand, as the Mishnah says, Ezu Chacham, what is the essence of Chochmah? What is real wisdom? Haro'eh et hanolad. Somebody who can see that which has barely been conceived, but he can see already that it's been conceived. Chacham ro'eh et hanolad does not mean a Navi. It does not mean somebody who can see the future. Haro'eh et hanolad means somebody that can see that which has just been conceived. Imagine a woman is just conceived. Nobody knows that she's pregnant, but a Chacham can see. He's not seeing something into the future. It's the present. She's already conceived. It's just nobody else can see it. That's what a Chacham is. A Chacham can see an opportunity, not because he knows there's going to be an opportunity. He can see the opportunity now, but other people aren't able to see that. That's the idea of Ro'eh. And we have the case of Re'iyah, of the power of vision leading us astray. We had it in last week's Parsha. What was that? Where did we have the vision leading us astray in last week's Parsha? Not this last Shabbos, the one before, the Meraglim, right? They saw things. They went to Israel in order to see, and they saw, and they drew wrong conclusions. So that was a very costly error. And in this week's Parsha, we've got Korach. And Rashi asks, V'Korach shepikach haya, me ra'ah lishtut zeh. What did Korach see? What did he envision that led him into this craziness? He must have had a vision. He must have seen something. He must have been after something that was real for him. Says Rashi, Eino hitato. He was led astray by his eye. It was in fact his vision which caused all the problem. What did he see? Ra'ah shalshelet gedula yotzet mimeno. He could see into the future. He was a ro'eh. So he was on prophetic level. Korach was a very, very great person. That was why what happened was so very strange. That's why Rashi says, Pikach haya mara alish tutzeh. What led him into this? Korach is such a great man. He saw Shmuel sheshakul keneged Moshe v'Aaron. He saw Shmuel, the ro'eh of the future, who's considered in his generation as great as Moshe and Aaron were in their generation. Shmuel is a descendant of his. Amar bishvilo ani nimlat. Korach said, I'm not going to be wiped out if Shmuel is one of my descendants. Surely I have the merit to survive this. And he saw all the Nevi'im that come from him. He could visualize this. Amar efshar kol hagdula azot atida la'amod mimeni v'adi ani edom. All this greatness is going to come from me. Should I just stand by silently when I'm being ignored for the positions here? Therefore he took part in this whole thing. Sheshama mipi Moshe shekulam ovdim ve'echad nimlat. He heard from Moshe that everybody was going to be wiped out except one person. One person was going to survive. Asher yivchar Hashem hu HaKadosh. Moshe says, who Hashem chooses, that one will be the Kodesh, meaning, of course, Aaron. Ta'ah v'tala ba'atzmo. He said, as long as one person is going to survive, who's that one person going to be? Has to be me, because I can see Shmuel and all these great people coming from me. The one person to survive has to be me. V'lo ra'ah yafeh, says Rashi. But he wasn't looking well. He didn't see correctly. So it was his vision. He had a vision. The vision was accurate. Shmuel is going to come from him. All those Nevi'im do come from him. But lo ra'ah yafeh lefi shebanav asu tshuva u'Moshe haya ro'eh. What he didn't realize was, it wasn't because of his greatness that all these people were going to come from him. It was for the greatness of his children who did tshuva. That was going to be a completely different reason for it. He missed it. He misinterpreted the vision. He had a vision. He saw facts. He had information. The information was accurate. There was no distortion. He interpreted it incorrectly. Let's try and understand why. What led him to interpret it so incorrectly? And here we come to that letter Chet that is associated with the month of Tammuz, Tammuz with Re'iyah, because the very next month that we're going to have is the month of Av, and the Sefer Yetzirah says in the very next sentence, Himlich ot tet bishmiyah. Hashem connects the letter tet to listening and associates it with the month of Av. So Hashem connects Chet with seeing and Tet with listening. And what does Chet and Tet mean together? So there's the famous medrash that when Yaakov was giving a bracha to his sons, and he asks all his sons to come around, Bikesh legalot lehem haketz v'nistam mimenu, he wanted to tell them what's going to be. Yaakov was a ro'er. Yaakov could see the future. Before he died, he wanted to share his vision of the future with his children. As they gathered around him, he lost the sight of it. He just couldn't see it anymore. So he figured there must be hate, there must be sin among his children, because everything was going fine until they all walked into the room. And Yaakov says, maybe one of you is sinning. And they said, but look at our names. The letters Chet and Tet aren't in our names anywhere, meaning there is nothing of sin in us. There is no sin in us. But why does the Medrash talk about it that way, the letter of Chet Tet? Why is it relevant that there's no letter Chet and letter Tet in the names of the tribes? Why that connection? And the reason for that connection is exactly because of the sequencing of Tammuz and Av. So if Tammuz is Chet and Av is Tet, and Chet and Tet spell Chet. Yes, there's still the Aleph, but you see from the Medrash that the word Chet and Tet already means Chet, even without the Aleph. Just Chet and Tet together spells Chet, it spells sin. And it's the sequencing, it's the Chet before the Tet that creates sin, which means it's the Tammuz before the Av that creates sin. We know that this is a very difficult time of the year. We know that this is a time where we have made a lot of mistakes, where we have failed as a nation over and over and over again, and we've been punished during this period. So we know it's a dangerous time of the year. And part of the danger is the sequencing of Tammuz, then Av, Chet, then Tet, Re'iyah, then Shmiyah, seeing, then listening. And why is that so important? That's important because we said there are these two ways of perceiving the world. There's these two ways of seeing reality, of seeing existence, of experiencing existence. The one is Re'iyah, the one is through sight, the one is through sound, through Shmiyah. And the differences between sight and sound is that sight gives you clarity. There's no doubt, there's no question. When you see something, there's no dilemma. You know exactly what you've seen, and you're seeing reality. You're seeing data, you're seeing information. It's factual. There's no doubt about that. But you're only seeing the surface. You're not seeing anything beneath the surface. Sound is open to interpretation. Different people hear the same thing, and each person hears something a little different. Whether it's words that each person hears and interprets differently, or whether it's music that each person hears, it means something differently to them. We interpret sound uniquely and differently. Sight is universal. What you see, what everybody sees, the same thing. And sound, although they might hear the same thing, it doesn't formulate in their minds in the same way at all. And sound comes from much more deeply within the object. You know, you could have 6 glasses on the table, and you could click each one of those glasses, you could ping them, and each one sounds different, although they look exactly the same. And they're manufactured identically because sound comes from the inside. On the surface, they look the same. From a perspective of Re'iyah, every one of those glasses look identical. From the perspective of Shmiyah, if you hear the sound from within that resonates from inside the material, the fabric of the object that you're pinging, that comes from inside. That vibrates from deep within. The whole thing is vibrating. Re'iyah is only the surface. Shmiyah, the whole object. You're listening to the sound of the whole object. If you take a musical instrument, you can take 6 violins, all manufactured in the same way. They sound differently because the vibration of an object is its whole essence and being that vibrates. And it's the same when a person when a person talks, each person talks from within their own experience. Each person, even if they say the same words, their tone of voice is different. They sound differently. So when you're listening to somebody, you're listening to something deep. When you're looking at somebody, you're seeing something superficial. And that's why it is when we get into stereotyping of people, and you see people that look a certain way and you make certain assumptions because all you can see is the surface. You know nothing about them. When they start speaking, you realize you've actually got more in common with them than you thought, although they look very different from you, or sometimes somebody looks the same as you. And when you get speaking, you realize their life experience is so different from yours. You have very little in common. When you get to the sound that comes from the soul of an object or of a human being, you get to the unique essence of that person or that thing or that being. It's much, much more deep, but it is open to interpretation, whereas Ru'iyah, sight, is not open to interpretation. And now comes the interesting thing of how we generally use these two capacities, how we use sight and sound. So what we very often do is we use sound to make sense of sight. We use sound to make sense of what we're seeing. So, for example, I might see somebody and notice they're looking unhappy. And I might say to them, "Are you feeling okay?" And they then tell me what's troubling them. So I've noticed that they're unhappy. I question, now I get the sound, because sound is about nuance. Sound is about context. And now I get the context. The person tells me what's happening in their lives, and I understand what I saw. So I use sound in order to explain, in order to interpret what I see. Very often, that creates the distortion. So let's take an example from last week's parasha. The Meraglim go to Eretz Israel and they see. What do they see? They see massive fortified cities. That's fact. That's data. They saw that. They saw giants. They saw strong people. They saw people dying in funerals all over the place. These were facts. They saw all that. So now they've got to interpret what they see, what they saw. And they use Shmiya, they apply an interpretation, and they come to the conclusion, this is a powerful nation, people die there all the time, it's not a place we want to be as a nation. So they've seen certain things, and then they've used their intellectual capacity to make some kind of sense of what it is that they've seen. And that can lead us to a lot of mistakes, because one of the examples that I sometimes give is you can have two people in a relationship. You can have a husband and a wife, and he senses that something might be wrong, and he says to her, "Everything okay?" She says, "Yeah, fine." And he takes it at face value. What does face value mean? Yeah, everything looks fine. You look fine. You say you're fine, so you're fine. Without actually understanding that perhaps you haven't got the whole picture. Because for that you would have to hear the whole picture. From the sight perspective, a person can look very cheerful on the outside. But if the person begins to speak, you realize that's only a veneer. And sometimes the veneer is only a small slice of what's really happening deep down in the person. And sometimes the veneer is a disguise. The veneer is there so that you shouldn't know what's going on deep inside the person. Sometimes what we see and what we hear are not aligned at all. And the question now is, do we try and align what we hear to what we see, or the other way around? Do I say, what I see, everything seems fine, so now I will interpret as fine, or I go to Eretz Israel as a spy and everything I see looks terrible, so I'll give it a meaning of terrible? Or do I do it the other way around? Do I start off with the Shmiya? So in the case of the Meraglim, how would that work then? What was their Shmiya? What have they heard? They've heard from Hashem and they've heard Moshe. Eretz Yisrael is a wonderful land. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. It's an Eretz Zavat Chalav Udvash. We're going to go there. We're going to conquer it. We're going to inherit it. We're going to live in it. That's what I've heard. What I see doesn't line up. What I see is a strong nation who will not allow us to conquer them, and who wants to conquer them because there are people dying there all the time. So the two pictures don't line up. What I've been told and what I see don't line up. I've got to align the one with the other. Which one is dominant? And the dominant one for most people is what you see, because that's the most instant thing. That's the most superficial thing. That's the thing that makes the immediate impression. And then you kind of make you almost force the meaning. Shmiya is the meaning, the understanding. You force the understanding to make sense of what you've seen, rather than the other way around. And yet that's not the way to do it. What we learn here is that when you do that, when you start with the Ru'iyah in Tammuz, with the Chet, and then you fit the Shmiya on top of the Ru'iyah, you fit the listening, the sense, the context, into what you've seen, and the foundation is what you saw, the result of that is Chet. That leads astray. So Korach saw Shmuel coming out of him. Korach saw these generations of great people coming out of him. That's data. That's fact. He saw it. Now everything he's thinking has to fit into that story. That's now the narrative. The narrative is, I'm the forefather of Shmuel. If I'm the forefather of Shmuel, surely I'm one of the greatest people alive. And if Moshe says only one person is going to survive that, surely it's me. That's forcing the narrative into what you've seen. Rather than to start off with what you've heard. I've heard that Aaron is the Kohen Gadol. I've heard that I'm a Levi, that I'm not a Kohen. I've heard that that's how Hashem wants the nation to be structured, that there are Kohanim and there are Levim, and the different families of the Levim have different roles, and then there are the Yisraelim, and there are men, and there are women, and there are Talmidei Chachomim and ordinary people. That's what makes the nation up. That's what I've heard. What I see is Shmuel coming from me. Well, maybe the narrative's different. Maybe my children are going to be very great children, and that's going to be the reason that Shmuel is descended from me, not because of my merit, but because of the merit of my children. Now I can make sense of the narrative if I start off with what I hear, rather than starting off with what I see. And we see that at Matan Torah. What is the verse in Matan Torah? V'chol ha'am ro'im et hakolot. And the nation saw the sound. What is the foundation? The sound. They created a vision out of what they heard. They didn't create a narrative out of what they saw. What they saw was a mountain. What they saw was fire. They didn't create the narrative out of that. They start with what they hear. They hear, Anochi Hashem Elokeichem, I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt, and the Aseres HaDibrus and everything. That's what they hear. That's the foundation. What we hear is our Mesorah. What we hear is what we're taught by our teachers. Sha'al avicha v'yagedecha. Get the narrative from your father, from your grandfather, from your teachers, from your rabbeim. Get the story from them. And then use your power of vision to look at the data and at the facts, and to be able to fit the facts into what you've heard, not to fit the narrative, not to fit the story into the facts that you've observed, because the facts, what you see, is superficial. What you see is only the surface. What you hear is deep. Start with what you hear. That's what's so unique about the Jewish people. The Jewish people, you see in the Torah over and over again, we're an audial people. We hear, we listen, we learn. There's Torah Sheba'al Peh, it's handed down from father to son. We're about communication. We're about listening, hearing. As the Maharal said, receiving, taking in through what we hear. We're not a nation of lookers and of seers. That's Yefet, that's Greece, that looks at aesthetics, that looks at beauty, that stands from a different distance and admires the beauty out there. We're about narrative, we're about a story, we're about background, we're about values, we're about philosophy, which we hear and which we learn. And then the beauty builds out of that. The beauty is not something that's separate from the narrative that we learn. V'chol ha'am ro'im et hakolot. Says Rashi, ro'im et hanishma, she'i efshar lirot b'makom acher. They saw that which was heard, something which couldn't otherwise be done. That becomes a real model for the way we're meant to learn Torah. It's interesting that Reb Chaim Volozhiner explained the difference between his brother and the Vilna Gaon, because he was asked, your brother knew the Torah by heart, inside out as well. You could ask him, you could quote a word of Gemara to the Reb Chaim Volozhner's brother, and he could carry on from where he left off. In what way was the Vilna Gaon greater than your brother? They asked Reb Chaim Volozhner. And Reb Chaim Volozhner said, you're right, my brother, you could take any word in Shas and put a pin on it, and he would carry on telling you all the rest. And there are people who, as I'm sure you've heard, my father met such people, you could take a pin or a needle and put it through a page of Gemara, and he could tell you on what word it would come out on each daf, on each page. You could actually pierce the volume, and he would tell you on every page what word would that's the kind of level of clarity they had. So they said to Chaim Volozhny, in what way was the Vilna Gaon different? And he said the Vilna Gaon could do something unique. You could take any word in Shas, anywhere, and you could ask him to start reciting forward or backwards. He could go from there and recite backwards to the beginning of Shas. And Reb Chaim Volozhny explained that the Briskerov talks about that explanation is because it says in Mishlei, Uchetov al luach libecha, write the Torah on the tablet of your heart. And Reb Chaim Volozhny meant the Vilna Gaon had it all written out on his heart, so he could read backwards or forward. He didn't have to recall it. He didn't have to remember it. He could just read it quite easily. There's a lovely story of a man called Rabbi Yair Weinstock. Rabbi Moshe Yair Weinstock lived in Yerushalim here in the beginning of the 20th century. Was a Talmid of the Maharil Ashlag, who was the man who wrote the Sulam Perush on the Zohar, very famous Kabbalist. And Rav Ashlag was giving a shir, and Ben Zion Weinstock was sitting next to Rav Ashlag, and he was gazing up into the corner of the room at the ceiling. He was gazing there, and Rav Ashlag kept on saying to him, "Concentrate, listen to what I'm saying." So, he's concentrating. And at the end of the shir, he says to Ben Zion, he says, did you hear? He said, yes. He said, can you repeat the shir? He said, sure. And he repeated the shir word for word, from beginning to end. So Rav Ashlag said to him, so why were you looking up there all the time I was speaking? He said, because each word that you said was kind of hovering, and then I pinned it onto the wall. And then when you asked me to repeat it, I just read it off the wall. The idea of taking what you hear and giving it the clarity of sight, to be able to see it, to be able to ro'im et hakolot, to take something that you hear, and when you hear it, there's some vagueness to it, there's subjectivity to it, and to give it the clarity of vision, to give it as if you can actually see every single word of it. That's the power of Re'iyah. And it's important that power of Re'iyah, that power of seeing, is not only to be able to see with your eyes, with your physical eyes. There's an amazing Alshich. The Alshich is in Parshas Noach. Vayikach Shem v'yefet tasimla vayasimu al Shechem shnehem vayelchu achoranit. This was the time when Noach got drunk and he was naked. And Shem and Yefet take a blanket, they hold it over their shoulders, and they walk backwards towards their father to cover their father up. Vayechasu et arvat avihem, and they cover the nakedness of their father. Ufnehem achoranit, and their face was back, was away from their father. Ve'ervat avihem lo ra'u, and they never looked at their father's nakedness. Asks the Alshich, why does it have to say, and their face was backwards? We're told that. It says, Vayelchu achoranit. They took the blanket and they walked backwards. So of course their face was away from their father. Why does the Torah repeat it? V'gam omrei ve'ervat avim lo ra'u, and then to tell us, and they couldn't see their father's nakedness. Of course they couldn't. We've just been told. They deliberately walked backwards with this blanket behind them so that they wouldn't see. Of course they didn't see it. Can't we work out that if they walked backwards, they couldn't have seen their father's nakedness? The reason that says the Alshich is, the reason they turned their faces backwards, why didn't they just work forward and close their eyes? If they didn't want to see their father, that's all they needed to do. Why walk backwards? That's why the Torah tells us why they walked backwards. Not straight with their eyes closed. It's only because they walked backwards that they couldn't see their father's nakedness. Because you can see with your face. you don't need your eyes. It's an unbelievable Kabbalistic concept. Your eyes can be closed. And you know that. We all know that. There are times when your eyes are closed and you can see what's happening. There are times when you're half asleep and you can see what somebody walks into the room and you're aware of it, not just because of sound, but you can see. And that's even because maybe through your eyelids there's light that passes, but it's not even that. It's the face, the whole face is an organ of Re'iyah. It's not only the eye. And therefore they didn't want their face to be able to be face to face with their father's nakedness, because even that could impact. And that, says the Al-Sheikh, is the idea of libor or et ha'erva, that a man is not allowed to daven. That's where the Hasidic minhag of having a gartel is, of putting a belt on. And misnagdim, people who are not Hasidim, also are supposed to wear belts, so that there's a separation between the heart and the lower part of the body. Shelo yehi libor ro'eh et ha'erva, and the word used is see, so that the heart doesn't see the nakedness. What does that mean, the see? When you are in the physical presence of something, presence is seeing. You can detect visually something that you are in the presence of, even if your eyes are closed. If you're in the presence of something or someone great, even if you can't see it, you can experience it, you can sense it. So we need to become more sensitive to that. We need to realize what presence is, both in the sense of being present, what you're able to be impressed by, what you can be sensitive to when you're in the presence of something positive or negative, and also that your presence, that you can communicate through your face, and be present and be able to transmit an energy, because vision is energy. We're talking about waves. That's what you see. You're seeing light waves. And the projection of visual energy and the reception of visual energy is not only through the eye, but the entire face is capable of that. And that's why it's possible to envision, to be able to see things that other people can't necessarily see. So if you look at the Shema, with the mitzvah of tzitzit, what does it say? V'hayalachem letzitzit uriyitem oto. You should have tzitzit, and you should see, and then do what? Uzachartem et kol mitzvot Hashem. And from the seeing, now you go to the narrative. Now remember the mitzvot. Now remember the Torah. And fit what you've learned into, and being able to take that which you've seen, and to be able to make sense, take what you've seen and impose it on the mitzvot of the Torah, and understand the connection, and to that, and not to be somebody who goes acharei einechem, that just follows the eyes and makes the narrative fit the eye. Rather, make what you see fit imut to zachartem, that which you remember, that which you already know from the Torah that you've learned. That's where we'll leave it for now, with this idea of Tammuz leading into Av. The idea that there is Re'iyah and there is Shmiyah. There are things that we see, there are things that we hear, there are things that we know as data, and there are things that we understand from a perspective of context and meaning. What's important is that what we understand through meaning is something that we gain, that is independently understood. It's not built on what we saw. That we start off as Jewish people, we start off with the power of hearing. We start off with learning. We start off with what we're taught. We start off with the Masorah that we're given. We hear, we listen, we learn. And then we give what we've heard the clarity of vision, rather than taking the vision that we've had and then give it narrative. And if you look at the world today and the mess that the world is in, how much of it is just that? As we said, starting off, this disconnect between what we hear and what we see. Imagine if, just take news channels, for example, if the journalists of the world would start with Shmiyah. They would start trying to understand what's happening. They would start trying to learn what's really the context, the nuances, speak to people, get the whole story, and then take the photographs that convey what's really happening, rather than to take the photographs and then create a narrative around the photographs. If you look at everything that's happening today, it's the inversion of the visual and the audio. It's the putting Tammuz before Av. It's putting the Chet before the Tet, which just leads to Chet. And what our purpose at this time of the year needs to be is to invert that. and to make sure that we put Shmi'ah before Ru'iyah. That we first learn context, we learn the essence, we learn what's true, we learn the soul stuff, we get into the essence of what's really happening. And then we come to a clarity of vision that supports that which we've learned and that which we've understood, using the powers of Shmi'ah. And if each of us can make our own effort to be more meticulous about that, when you're reading something, when you're seeing a picture, when you're seeing something on social media, when you're hearing the news, always just check with yourself. Am I reacting to an image, or am I reacting to deep understanding of the entire issue? In the old days, if you wanted to know news, you had to read an article. And by the time you'd read a whole article, you'd read some of the arguments, you'd read some of the pros and cons, you had some kind of a feel. It wasn't instant. Now it's a headline and an image. And from a headline and an image, you come to Chet. To start with the Ru'iyah and then go to the Shmi'ah, we come to Chet. Just to check ourselves. Each time we find ourselves, just ask, are we short-circuiting from the image directly? Is that where we're starting everything? Or are we starting with a much deeper understanding and using image to provide the clarity that we need? And with that, hopefully in each in our own ways, to provide a different energy in the world, one that puts more emphasis on understanding than on seeing, puts more emphasis on learning and teaching than on visual, that is willing to invest the time to really understand, to understand the other person, to understand what somebody is saying, to understand what is being said and what has been written, to understand what is happening, and then to develop clarity around what it is that we've learned and what we've understood. I meant to mention at the beginning of the shir that unfortunately just minutes before we started the shir, a very dear niece of mine was nifteret. She passed away in Baltimore. Her name was Rina, my brother Daniel Lapin's daughter, and the learning today should be Le'ilui Nishmata. We wish the family nechama, just some level of comfort in this very, very difficult and hard time. Thank you all for joining.